Thank you all for attending. It's really good to actually see so many people wanting to build on Bitcoin. Now, I'm going to talk about a concept called overlay or layered networks. You don't put everything on one network. So you can, but you're going to pay a lot of money in the future. What we want to do is ensure that we use the hashing functions the way that they're meant to be. Hashes are not cryptographic functions. They're part of protocols. So you can create a cryptographic protocol using a hash, but you can also use it for indexing and aligning information. What a hash does is it ensures data integrity. So what we can do is we can start using all of the features of Bitcoin. We can do the timestamping, the ordering, make sure that people know the order of transactions, not just now, but years, decades in the future. And that will enable us to do all sorts of things, like auction networks, like capturing the sort of exchange of state in computers, etc. But the reality where people go wrong is they have this concept that they need to capture everything on every machine, that every person on Earth needs to verify everyone because no one can trust anything. We don't. When I created Bitcoin, I created SPV, Simplified Payment Verification, for one simple reason. What you're now able to do is match the hash of a block against your transaction. Because really, what you care about is your transaction. You care that the transaction you're receiving is valid, that you're getting paid correctly. No one cares about someone else on Earth getting a transaction that's wrong. You also know that an invalid transaction won't be sent to the blockchain. But see, the way Bitcoin started working was different. It was peer-to-peer in that you had two networks. You had individuals actually using IP. So we would connect to each other and basically be able to exchange transactions. And the original protocol had even more features than Bitcoin Core has now, because you could even communicate with the person, send messages back and forwards. It was ugly, there were no fonts, there were no nothing else, but you could do this. So as a proof of concept, you would be able to do things like invoicing, negotiating with customers, and then basically finalizing and taking a payment. What I didn't realize at the time is a lot of the people who came into Bitcoin had different concepts of what they believed a payment system should be. Unfortunately, it took me a while to pick up that there were people who didn't ever want anything to do with Bitcoin. What they wanted was a system that enabled them to commit financial crime, sell drugs, be anarchists, take down governments, whatever else. Bitcoin doesn't do that. No blockchain will. Because Bitcoin is not encrypted. That simple. So early things that were on Bitcoin that were not robust or whatever else, the fact that miners would be able to take back coins, in 2009 and 2010, that was a big problem. It's not now. The reason is we have professional miners who run large companies, and they will basically act on court orders. And if you think they won't, well, any miner who doesn't do that will just be orphaned by the rest. Because if even Antpool or whatever else decided, no, I don't like the American government and there's a valid court order, then they'll have to basically pay the American government or be shut down. So we have a system now that enables you to build something that is honest and recoverable, but also immutable. So immutable doesn't mean that you can never have a record that is reissued because of court orders or anything like this. Immutable means that if there is a court order, if there is a change, if something happens, if an exchange loses their money, quadriga, or someone has a theft, it's still recoverable. But the recovery will be public. There is, I lost this Bitcoin. I've recovered this Bitcoin, not because I decided in a little anarchist DAO type hack that I can do whatever I want and change the system, but because I went through the process of law that has been built up over hundreds of years and decided basically to go to a court, prove the existence of something, show where you bought it, and then go through this process, which is something we can start doing. Now, if you're running a business, this is essential. Think about compliance and audit. Bitcoin does not remove identity. Identity is mentioned in my white paper, section 10. It changes the nature of how it works. Identity is not deleted from Bitcoin. The difference is, identity is a function between individuals. No longer do I have a large shopping center like Target having to own my data. No longer do I have Experian owning everything about me. What I now have is the ability to individually control my own information and to allow that to be updated, provably, so that when I go for a home loan, when I get a car loan, when I do anything like this where I'm seeking a credit card or something like that, I now control what is out there. I can now see when someone tries to make a home loan using my name. So there are a lot of people don't want my vision of Bitcoin. Just today, there was an indictment filed against 2 Chinese nationals who basically laundered millions of dollars worth of cryptocurrency and stole more for the North Korean government. So the North Korean government does not want my view of Bitcoin. Iran doesn't want my view of Bitcoin. People funding terrorism don't want my view of Bitcoin. But if you're a business and you have huge compliance costs, imagine now being able to instantly prove your customer's identity. Not because they have a key, but because encrypted data that is maintained off-chain in layered networks that the customer can manage, that the customer can protect on their own, or can pay other organizations if they want to do this, can be managed so that you can validate everything. So the concept of layered networks is using Bitcoin to create a whole infrastructure where there is no changes to web pages over time, where people don't hack things and change them, where deleted logs, which is one of the first things cyber criminals will do, are no longer a problem. So what we're going to be doing is having the miners as our notary and sort of reference system, allowing the indexes to actually map out far more. So in the future, we're talking already about Terranode type blocks and whatever else, which started in 2013 with my failed attempt with iDemon to make a microservices infrastructure, which failed because Bitcoin Core kept changing. And as Daniel will tell you, it's really hard to actually code a microservices architecture with a protocol that changes every few months. It's incredibly difficult. So my team in Australia did a pretty good job, despite the fact that everything kept moving. And that made life really difficult. But what we're going to start doing is allowing people not just to think they need to build on top of Bitcoin. The strength of Bitcoin script is, as a predicate, as a scripting language, it's fast and easy to check. So one of the things I used to do before Bitcoin, I used to do malware research, reverse engineering and things like that, but I also used to do code review and pick on code and whatever else. And script is simple. It's not like in the DAO type situation in Ethereum where things are complex and have lots of problems. When it's implemented correctly, Bitcoin script can be followed, can be verified, and you know without any of the halting problem type issues that it will end. So you can have offline things. You can link the ability to have other oracles continuously fund things. Not that every single node on the network is going to be required to validate everything. You don't want that. You don't want constraint by Raspberry Pi. You want to be able to link state in a provable manner and have separate layers of consensus. All of the networks that we had in the period between, say, 1991 to 2002, where the collapse of the dot-com market really killed off the whole investigation into peer networks, we can start doing. Microsoft, one of the reasons I built Bitcoin on Visual Studio on Microsoft was Windows XP actually used to have a fairly robust peer-to-peer networking infrastructure that no one really knew about. And we could have started building applications. We could have implemented Windows security and more. We could have started different communities, different domains, different structures, different businesses, all linked on top of Bitcoin. Things where we have individuals having their own rule sets. Not separate coins, not ICOs and all this other BS that pops up every few years, which in 1990s was called web IPOs and was digital tokens, traded, pumped, dumped, and no one did anything. And before that it was pink sheet scams, and before that it was mail scams, and before that it was different types of scams, and ICO scams are just the latest in a series of old scams. No, not that. Something where records don't get lost when coins get lost. Something where now we have the ability to actually build things. Not this, I need funding, give me $50 million. People who innovate and have ideas can raise money in the normal, everyday way, and having too much money is actually a bad thing. Getting $100 million really quickly when you're an early startup just means you'll never actually finish your project. It means, like Mt. Gox, you'll decide it's more important than code security and making a robust system to have a cyber cafe. Because if you don't have a cyber cafe, how can you have a digital platform? Yeah. That's what happens when you have too much money too quickly, and that's what ICO people don't get. If you have a company and fail, learn from it. It's not about raising a lot of money and being able to sit around in your pajamas. You'll never succeed. And people talk to me about this and say, I've got all these failed companies in my past, some more failed than successful. Good, because I didn't give up. I didn't stop. That's the whole point. It's not whether you failed. I failed and bailed people out. I didn't leave any of my companies in administration owing any debt other than to me and my wife. We paid every staff member. The only people who lost were us. So the simple thing is, yes, I failed many companies. And yes, many of these will fail. But you learn. And the good thing here is we will be able to start remembering what Steve talked about earlier with Nakamoto and history. Bitcoin is not the first peer-to-peer cryptocurrency. Bitcoin is not the first distributed cryptocurrency. It is the first distributed proof-of-work cryptocurrency with tracing. That's the difference. An immutable record that never goes. That is different. So, Mojo Nation, eDonkey, Guatemala, all of these actually had cryptocurrencies associated with them. Mojo Nation was early on, so it's a little bit disingenuous of certain people in Zcash who were actually part of the Mojo Nation platform to say that they know nothing about these sort of things. And I don't believe that what they're doing is anything to be proud of. I mean, Mojo Nation, the group was evil geniuses for a better world, but I don't think by allowing children to buy drugs you're making a better world. So we want you to start thinking about how you can construct different organizations with a single registry, with a single timestamp, with a single way of basically matching currencies. And I see the euro and the pound and the dollar being built on top of Bitcoin because it will do it cheaper than their central banks can do it right now. And that's the key. Bitcoin allows very fast, instant transactions. And I'll say instant because you can see someone double spending quickly. It allows you to have payments that are true micropayments. That's the thing that Bitcoin did that no other system in human history has done. No one else has been able to make a system that is fractions of a cent. Alipay, WeChat Pay, all of these enable transactions today. Even the systems like Liberty Reserve, eCash, DigiCash, all those enabled transactions digitally. None of them were under 5 cents a transaction, ever. And we don't want 5 cents a transaction. We don't want 1 cent a transaction. We don't want 1/100th of a cent a transaction. I want to see fractions of a fraction of a cent, thousandths of a cent. But then being able to have SPV communities where people verify and finalize on-chain, enabling the creation of multi-layered sort of architecture that is not just Bitcoin as money, but complex scripts that use the tokens, the indivisible tokens within Bitcoin, as markers so that they can represent other things, represent control functions, represent security functions. They can then act as two-factor authentication. You can then have records of all of that as well. Not because everyone runs a node, but because commerce. Because miners will come and go based on what is profitable. This is how we know that it will happen. If a miner is not profitable, that miner goes out of business. If that miner, say, had 10% of the network hash, 10% of the network hash disappears, but because of utility, not the gambling casino we see now, Bitcoin is valuable through use. The use doesn't change because a miner disappears. What then happens is the value per block increases. So some other miner will come in, and there's always an equilibrium. So basically, we have all these things that aren't required of miners as well. And SPV worked because IP to IP of other ways. I want to see not only IP to IP, which was in the original Bitcoin platform, but things like Bridgefly. So Bridgefly was a protocol implemented in Hong Kong, allowing basically people who were protesting against China at the time, after the internet was cut off, to communicate over Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Imagine now that we have a means of implementing all those mesh networks and making mesh networks work, because what we now have is a timestamping service. We know which transactions are valid and real. We can get a direct communication of a large transaction and then match the index, the hash. So even if we're doing gigabyte transfers offline, we can have something that proves the condition of those transfers in Bitcoin. And some of the patents that I've been doing enable us to have sequential hashing, so that rather than having to wait for all 1 gigabyte to come down, or all 1 petabyte to come down, we could know that the transaction kilobyte by kilobyte, or megabyte by megabyte, is valid. Because we have a series of indexes on Bitcoin. And those indexes will allow people to build scalable networks transmitting data, whether it's movies that you could pay for bit by bit, whether it's scientific data. For instance, look at the petabytes that are moved around right now because of space research, where what happens is they pick up boxes of rack-based computers and move them from data center to data center because it's easier and cheaper right now. Why not form better ways of doing this? So we need order. We need to know which transaction orders we had. Bitcoin solves that. We need timestamping. Bitcoin solves that. And previous timestamp servers, the ones run by VeriSign and others right now, have a huge problem. If they're ever compromised, everything in their history is compromised. Not from this point forward. A compromise of a certificate in Bitcoin means a compromise from now on, and you have to get a new certificate. A compromise of an RSA or VeriSign certificate means if you've been using that certification structure for 20 years, the last 20 years are now invalid. That's the problem with PKI right now. Why didn't it take off? People sit there going, it could have been big, because there's no way to make it work when one central authority gets hacked and everything becomes ruined. And right now with the web of trust, when one company like DigiNotar gets hacked, everyone's hacked. The entire internet infrastructure can be brought down because one company did not manage their things properly. So we want to move beyond things like Cassandra, Hadoop, and distributed network nodes, etc., for computation and file share. We want to take that to a point where we can actually have these in encrypted public networks, where people, like in the old days of file sharing and LimeWire and whatever else, can now have provably sort of safe contained data that can be linked to individuals privately, but allow a distributed network of organizations globally. And like Alchemy and other companies that offer sort of web localization services, I see that people, rather than having full nodes in the future, will offer services to their locality. If you know that there is a community here in this part of Europe, why do you care about something that may only be of interest to people in Fiji? You cache the things that are basically important to the people near you, and you make data partitions so that you can sell information bit by bit, little tiny bits of information, enabling people to actually compete, not necessarily even have data that is not, that it won't be lost even. You can even have things you don't want to be there forever, and people can choose what they want permanently stored and what they don't. So this is a thing people don't understand. Not everything goes on the blockchain. Some of it is just indexes. You prove, if you have a copy, that it existed. But if you want to lose it, if it's your information, and you want a right to be forgotten, then you delete it. And if something's there and someone else comes up and says, but you had this information and you sent it to me 20 years ago, and there's a court case or whatever else, then it's provable without the other person. But at the same time, it's not public anymore. So what we have are layered smart contracts, not everyone having one thing. We can scale where Ethereum and others don't for one simple reason. Not everything runs on every node. You should never have this concept that everyone needs to run everything on your node. Rather than having all these different coins, what we want is to have different peer networks that are interconnected, that use a common platform, a common service, a common token across all of them. And some of these will have different values. So we will have different layers. This is what a layer is. It's not the Lightning Network side protocol thing. That's a gateway. That's not a layer. So if any of you remember the difference between IPX and IP, and Novell were coming up with these gateway protocols back in about 1994 or so that you could have IPX inside your network and IP out there and put the internet through still and whatever else. That's what Lightning is. What we're creating is a way of having proper layers, things encapsulated. You have a header, and then other information, and links. And that enables scaling, because then you can actually transmit petabytes worth of data and provably link every single bit of it. You can now have state rather than every computation. You can have the details of it so that you can recompute from a point in time without all of the problems that chaos theory tells us, because you can have the complete state saved. So what we're doing in all of this is creating a system that is effectively going to enable you to build things that none of us have thought about. That's the end here. So if you're a telecommunications provider, rather than having the tried and true way of doing things, you can start new models. You can start building mesh networks in local communities. Things such as if you're in somewhere like Nairobi, they're not going to get 5G anytime soon. In the Central Congo Basin, no one's going to be putting 5G towers out there. And if they did, someone would probably blow them up. What you can do, you can enable people to start mesh networks. And how do you make this work over communities? You allow people to keep track. So all of the problems in peer networks, the legal ones, and there were even legal ones back then, came from the fact that you could never attribute to people this concept, well, everyone's going to be nice. Some people will be nice, and some people will abuse the system. And if we put a monetary value on it, now we can actually stop them abusing the system. Because if you're a leecher and you're paying, no one cares anymore. That guy who's seeding files, who gets money, is not going to go, these damn leechers keep using my thing and giving me money. I'm getting so disillusioned because I keep coming home and no one else is seeding the file. They just pay me all the time. That's the concept here. So if you want to have people find routes through disparate networks in the middle of nowhere, rather than buying and putting in 5G towers and trying to build where people will be, why not let communities actually do this? Why not let someone put in a fiber and then have a hub that can grow out and expand in a honeycomb cellular fashion? The way cell phones were actually meant to originally work, way, way back. That's why they were called cell phones originally. Not just a tower, but overlaps. Imagine now being able to do that for information such as insurance, being able to collect information from many people. If there's an accident, if there's a crime, being able to collate all of this without any idea of fraud being able to occur. You can look at all the different views. No one can sit there and alter things after and try and get away with it. You will have basically a trail that goes on, but also the ability to set up private data rights. So the problem with most people's understanding of blockchain is they think it's all about the hashes following each other. It's not. It's because it's public. The concept of blockchain, which was a round chain or time chain, was created in 1991, and not by me. The difference here is it has to be public. Reference number 2 in the white paper describes this. They were talking about how you make it public, not by having a distributed peer network, but rather having newspapers that everyone would publish all these hashes in daily, which seems a bit cumbersome to me. I mean, got this internet thing, we may as well use it. So at the end of the day, what we now have to do is take this and build. to create, not to think of the existing paradigms, but think about all the promises we had 20 years ago even, what the internet was going to be. Not a network that tracks us for money, but something that enables people to connect. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.